Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nora Valenzuela. I'm the chair of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. And on behalf of the Executive Board and Board of Trustees, I wish to thank and welcome our honorable speakers today, Professor Fingar and Professor Oi. We will have our moderator, Mr. Rick Putnam, who will be moderating the program today. And please submit your questions through the chat, and they'll be sorted and discussed for further discussion with our colleagues. I would appreciate if everyone mute their microphones, and we have a tendency of sometimes the public may have their microphones on and it creates a bit of a distraction. I also want to mention that we are a nonpartisan organization, being in Orange County for 52 years. For those of you who are joining us nationwide, we welcome your participation. It's really exciting that we have an opportunity of having guests from all over US now today. As a nonpartisan organization, the question that comes through, if they have a political angle and they are politically sensitive, respectfully, we will decline to answer any questions that has a political motive. So we will try to be as fair and objective and respectful to everyone's view. With that, I'm gonna welcome our guests and also all of you, and turning it over to Rick Putnam, who's a member of our Board of Trustees, my colleague, and also a member of the program committee. And I'm honored to say that he's accepted my nomination and will be joining our executive board next year. So with that, turning it over to Rick. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. And thank you as well to all of our audience for joining today's webinar, again, hosted by our Orange County World Affairs Council. As Nora mentioned, my name is Rick Putnam, and I'm a council trustee and member of our programs committee. Be moderating today's event, again, featuring Professors Oi and Fingar, entitled Fateful Decisions, China's Domestic Challenges and Their Implications for Future US-China Relations. Fateful Decisions, Choices That Will Shape China's Future is also the title of their excellent book, which I can personally say offers a very illuminating view of China's inner workings for anyone who cares to order and read that. It will give you many, many insights into how China has come to where it is today. As Nora mentioned, today's event will run about an hour, and we encourage anyone who has questions to submit them at the chat bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Professors Oi and Fingar welcome a more conversational style to their presentation, so please be liberal with your questions and comments. A few summary words about their background. Both Jean Oi and Thomas Fingar are endowed professors within their field at Stanford University within the school's Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. Both have published numerous books and papers on China and on dynamics in the Asia Pacific region. Professor Fingar also has a working background in US government intelligence, and Professor Oi is an expert on domestic Chinese government entities and the Belt and Road Initiative. Professors, your book is so well organized around this very, very complex subject as it examines China's internal government institutions and their instruments of governance first, then considers a history of internal policy choices, and then finishes with China's external ambitions and constraints. So I'll now turn it over to you with perhaps an initial leading question. Many commentators discuss China's rise and future prospects in almost mechanistic terms, but you emphasize the importance of political choices and factors that will shape these policy decisions. Can you explain why you take this approach?
Well, thank you, Rick, for the question. Thank you to the World Affairs Council of Orange County for inviting us. We're delighted to have this opportunity to speak with and respond to questions from members. A few years ago, when we began this project, that the current narrative about China was beginning to take shape. And one part of that narrative described China as an unstoppable juggernaut, moving inexorably towards ambitions and abilities to achieve regional dominance and ultimately to challenge the United States for global preeminence. That the analyses, in quotes, that undergird these judgments, from our perspective as political scientists, were pretty thin. There was a sort of rising powers challenge existing status quo powers, or those that are the current hegemon, that gloss over the role of politics and political choice and the need to deal with very concrete problems. Any political system has to face domestic problems, security problems, diplomatic relations challenges. And as we have experienced China in the decades that we have worked in and on and with China, that we had a great deal of difficulty translating the knowledge that we had about the problems, the challenges, the approaches, the mechanisms, with assumptions about inevitable, or on the other end of it, the inevitable failure. That China had run out of gas, that it was doomed to flail around and fail. And we undertook this project to find out what the most important challenges were, what the choices might be, and what might shape decisions about which path to follow and what the implications would be. An important part of this was recognition or understanding on our part that the conditions under which China launched its reform and opening policies in the late 1970s are very, very different. External conditions are very different. To cite just the most obvious, the relationship with the United States, reform and opening, was born during the Cold War. And in 1991, the Soviet Union went out of business. That changed the basis of US-China relations. The success that China has had in its drive for modernization and sustained economic growth, demographic change. There are, give or take, 400 million more Chinese today than there were in 1978. That the country is very different, the context within which it is pursuing efforts to grow, efforts to play a different role on the world stage, and its efforts to meet the escalating needs and expectations and demands of its public are very different. Raise a real question about whether continued employment of mechanisms that worked in the past will work in the future. And Jean, why don't you pick up on that?
Okay, well, first, I want to thank both Nora and Rick for having us on, and great plug for our book. Let me just add to what Tom was saying by saying that what we wanted to do was really to take apart why China did so well in the first 40 years, and specifically, looking at the agencies, the institutions, if you will. And one of the things that, the conclusions that we came to is that China sort of got tremendous mileage by actually not changing the system that the reformers inherited in the late 1970s, that they really only tweak the institutions that were created for a centrally planned economy, but were able to really then just have growth take off. So we wanted to figure out, okay, so how did they do that? How did they get these bureaucrats, what we call, the local state agents, particularly because the China's growth, a lot of it has been based on entrepreneurial activity down at the local levels. It's these local level officials, these little factories, these that were set up in the countryside. This has been a major part that really kick-started China's economy. So we wanted to ask the question, and Tom's already mentioned, that the internal and the external context has changed. And so the other thing we did then is then to ask, okay, so they made a lot of the, you might say, easier changes. I mean, reform is never easy, but they managed to do a lot in changing the way that, for example, farmers are organized. They got rid of the commune system. But things like the state-owned enterprises, they've really had much more limited success. And I think using that concrete example, one of the things that one of the conclusions is that we give is that, well, some of these easier reforms have generated tremendous growth. But if the growth is going to continue, they're going to have to really tackle the most difficult problems now that they've been kicking down the road. And the question is, are they going to do it, and when are they going to do it? And also, do they have the luxury of actually picking when they do what kind of reforms? And so something like COVID comes along, and it really may sort of throw the choices off.
It sounds in a way as if the country is really using old institutions, older tools, entrenched systems to manage through an increasingly different world, especially as Russia and other alliances or other economies wax and wane on the stage. To be maybe a little bit more specific, I was fascinated to learn a little bit about the revenue sharing mechanism that goes on back and forth between what you call the center, and which I anticipate means Beijing and the leadership, versus the local government agencies or privately state-owned enterprises, and the debt that we hear so much about, that's a ticking time bomb within China. Can you maybe describe at length sort of how that all works and what the trends have been? It seems like it worked for a little while, and then things started to get stretched.
Okay, I mean, this is a very technical, but actually I would argue sort of a key part of Chinese politics. And here, it also, I think, highlights a point that the authorities in Beijing, as powerful as they are, and the fact that it is a one-party authoritarian system, they have always had to be very cognizant of getting the cooperation of their local level officials. And that's a point I made earlier, but once again, with regards to the fiscal system and local government debt, without getting into too much history, back in the early 90s, China's economy was booming. I mean, really booming after the reforms started. And the center felt that the localities were benefiting disproportionately from the revenues that were being generated. A lot of this money stayed in the localities. So what happened? Well, Beijing said, okay, we need to get some of these taxes back. And so they put in a new system that really tried to re-centralize tax revenues and give Beijing a much larger share. But interestingly, the only way they could do that was make some sort of, backroom under the table deals with local officials that said, okay, you give us the taxes that we want, but we're going to give you the autonomy to go out and generate new sources of revenue. But what this meant was that the formal fiscal system essentially left the localities with insufficient revenues, and that the only way that the localities could actually really do basic administrative tasks was to essentially come up with new fundraising mechanisms. And part of this ended up being borrowing. This local government debt was actually a method that was necessitated by the inadequacies of this central system. And so there's actually a phrase that the center has come up with recently because they want to change this. And so basically they said, okay, this was considered backdoor financing. And essentially Beijing knew about this and they said, okay, you can do this. And they allowed them to set up local state banks. And the most important thing is that they allowed them to engage what's called in land finance. In other words, using local land as collateral to raise money. And so you see land prices jumping up. But this also meant that the center had little really transparency into what was going on in at the local levels in terms of local finance. This is one of the reasons why local government debt is seen as dangerous because it started to mount. So it was one thing when, it was manageable, but after the global financial crisis, after the huge amount of borrowing that localities engaged in because of the stimulus package, the amount of debt that was being racked up at the local levels really became what they are now calling a gray rhino. In other words, something that's really dangerous and they better start paying attention to. And so this whole system is also very important because it then also is an explanation into other problems such as why localities actually don't want to welcome migrants because local budgets are being provided by Beijing based on outdated institutions. And so for locality to welcome migrants and to treat them as, give them access to the public goods would require that they go out and raise more funds and borrow more. So it's an extremely sort of complex and technical issue, but it really highlights really well this interesting this tension between center and locality and how they've got to try to balance all of this, but at the same time Beijing has control, the localities have their methods, and they all engage in this game, this charade essentially.
So to use that problem, local government debt or the back and forth that goes on there as an example, how does that constrain what China might do in the world? Is there a borrowing issue that China has, or is it a threat to their stock and securities markets, or to prices, or does it contribute to instability? What's the implication of this?
That's a great question, and I'm not an economist. And on the one hand, it's something that they have to get under control. And so let me just finish my other earlier thought by saying that what the center decided to do was to close this door to backdoor financing and open the front door and have local governments issue government bonds that Beijing then controls. So they want to get control of this. Now, how dangerous is local government debt? On the one hand, I think that it may not be as dangerous as it might first look, because on the one hand, a lot of this local government debt has actually gone to the construction of infrastructure. And so one could say, well, localities now have a lot more assets that they could use and they could sell actually to repay some of this debt. But that doesn't, of course, doesn't really help when some of this construction may not have been used to for constructing things that perhaps are not necessary. The bridges to nowhere type of thing. So I think at the moment, and that China is still in insufficient control of this, and that it's not going to be an imminent threat to their financial system. But what it does, I think, highlight is that increasingly, and one of the points that we wanted to make in the book is that, you know, China has a lot of resources and China can do things. The problem is now there are so many areas, and all these different areas have demands, and they need money. And so there are all these demands coming at Beijing, and this is on top of things like the BRI. So, you know, the question then becomes, well, you know, if you're sending money out for the BRI, what about all these internal demands? So that's going to create new pressures on the leadership.
Rick, if I may, let me elaborate or build upon the points Jean has made to get at how does it affect their ability to operate in the international arena. That, again, the context matters. When China was growing at double-digit rates for more than 3 decades, that it had plenty of money. The system is structured in a way that Chinese people, Chinese workers, get a relatively small percentage of all of the money that has been earned, which means the government has had a lot of money to build high-speed railroads and build up its military and improve portions of the education system and the like. But growth has slowed. It's no longer double digits. It's down to 6%. All the predictions are that it goes down to 2 to 4% pretty quickly. And that was before COVID. Before COVID threw a wrench in even that kind of planning. But the demands for funding from the center, from locality, it's got to come from someplace. Healthcare. COVID is clearly going to increase demand for improvements to the healthcare system. Anything in China that is intended to reach 1.4 billion people is going to cost a lot of money. A small increase in healthcare availability costs a lot of money. And China's healthcare system is reasonably adequate for contagious diseases and broken legs and things like that. But China's population is aging, so it's got a lot more coronary disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer, expensive diseases. It's got an aging population. China is about, I guess now 12 or 13 years from being at the point where it's over 65 population will exceed the total population of the United States. To be supported traditionally by family. But after 2 generations of 1 child per family, every young married couple can look forward to paying for 4 parents and 8 grandparents who are probably going to live to 80 years of age. So the money for elder care, the money for relief of the family's burden and healthcare expenses, that China seeks to become a consumer-based economy rather than an investment-based economy. But consumers have to have money to do that. They need a bigger share of GDP. They need disposable income that doesn't have to go to housing and care for grandma or healthcare or education. Rural education in China is among the most expensive in the world, beyond junior high school. That the expectations of the people that are going to have these things, the demands of sustained economic growth, you have to improve the quality of education to raise the level of the workforce in this. All of these require money and require decisions on who pays. Does the central government pay? Does the workplace pay? Does the local government pay? Does the family pay for these things? All of this constrains the amount of money and the political sensitivity of spending money on further military development, expansion. China has built a large military. It's now discovering what we and every other large country discovers: buying ships and airplanes is the cheap part. That maintaining, deploying, operating them, that's what's really expensive. Jean mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and the Chinese public asking Why are we spending money? Why are we giving grants to people who live in countries where the per capita income is higher than ours? China has modernized phenomenally, but its per capita income is still below the world average. China is still a middle income country that, unlike the other Asian tigers, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, that achieve very rapid growth, long periods of sustained growth, and then plateaued. China's growth plateaued before it had become a wealthy country. None of the others did. They all made it into higher income. And it's not a prestige point so much as it is a capacity point, that the capacity of the system to deal with the kind of demands that come with attainment of the level of growth in expectations and requirements across the board that China has now reached.
So it seems like you might be implying that with sort of the approach to the middle income trap, I think it's called, and these domestic constraints, which are across demographics, education, healthcare, maintaining the elderly population, et cetera, creates really a conflict between the population and local governments. Is the implication that this is going to be that there's some social unrest that's a problem and that constrains China, or is it purely a monetary issue that they'll just have to retreat, for instance, from some projects that are forecast for the Belt and Road Initiative?
Let me just start out by saying that it's not so much that it creates what you would say sort of the tensions at the local level between the people and the local officials. If anything, I think one of the important points that I think needs to be understood is that, interestingly, in the last decade or so, that China actually, and particularly at the local levels, but these are directions from Beijing, that they're spending a lot more time trying to ensure that there is stability and that there is paying attention to what we would call accountability. And so they have put in a lot of new channels for local citizens to register complaints, to, these helplines. They have like mayor's mailboxes, all of these things. So on the one hand, this is sort of the other side of the image that we have, that there's been a harsher crackdown, which is absolutely true. But at the same time, they're opening these more institutionalized channels. The danger, I think, is that they, because they are clamping down and there are fewer and fewer demonstrations and sort of collective action in the last number of years, that if there are serious tensions that are going to be arising, that the central and the local authorities may not be aware of them in time to take actions to quell them. So that may actually be a danger. Tom, if you want to add to that.
Two brief additions to that the leadership, the party state leadership, is clearly very afraid of discontent, demonstrations, disorder, among other reasons, because it's seen as an impediment to attracting foreign investment, to sustained economic growth, as creating a vicious downward spiral, that the system already spends more on the police than it does on the military, that the internal security is a big concern. It links to external behavior in that performance has been the principal pillar of legitimacy, the basis for acceptance of the regime and its controls, because life has gotten better for most Chinese pretty steadily. And give or take now, 70% of the population has known nothing except sustained economic improvement, growth, better jobs and opportunities. So they expect it, but that's tailing off. The other pillar is patriotism or nationalism. And that has contributed to the hardline posture that China has taken some places overseas, especially in Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, where I think the regime has painted itself into a corner with its emphasis on sovereignty, on never yielding an inch of Chinese territory to foreign pressure. That there are a lot of things to be unhappy about in China, but there are not a lot of things that you can complain about openly. But complaining about assertive, aggressive foreign behavior, trying to take advantage of China, is one of the things you can call to stand up to Vietnam or the Philippines or Japan or the United States. And it's very hard for the government to contemplate compromise because that looks like weakness and it conflicts with the legitimation mythology of the Communist Party of China. And if people are out in the streets demanding to stand up for China's claims to rocks in the South China Sea, once they're out in the street, they say, oh, by the way, we'd like clean water or air that we can breathe, or better education opportunities, or somebody to pay for my health care. There are a lot of other things, and the regime knows they can't satisfy all of these demands. The final point is, as Jean points out, this is not a totally repressive system. It is building in what we would call modern responsive mechanisms for responsibility and accountability in the system. But if the government makes concessions, if it yields to complaints, and once upon a time, nobody knew it except the officials involved and the local people. Now it spreads instantly on social media. So there is the danger, whether they are repressive or they make concessions, that instantly 1,000 other locations in the country could know about it and say, well, maybe, what about us?
Mm-hmm. Good point. So I want to come back to sort of the international and US-China relations part of this, but there's been a couple of questions that have come in and relate to, again, these internal constraints. And a couple of them do relate to the suppression of ethnic minorities, the Uyghur, the Han peoples. And I think there's a couple of commonalities to a few of these questions, which are, can China continue to grow towards its full potential, or perhaps gain that extra 1% of GDP growth per year if it does not more effectively integrate those minorities and also women into its infrastructure, governmental systems?
I'll start. That China, first, just a correction. It's the Uyghurs and the Hui, not the Han. The Han right. is the minority, is the majority population. 92 or 3% of the population are Han. But it's the Hui, the other Muslim minority that recently has experienced more repression. That China has all the slogans right on the need to include women, include minorities. Everybody is needed to achieve national strength, prosperity, and objectives, the rejuvenation of China or the China dream. It's rhetorically inclusive, but the biggest gap is between rural and urban. That a lot of social benefits are based on official place of residence, which is either urban or rural. most people have a rural residency permit basis, and that determines eligibility for healthcare, retirement, disability, education, hooking up to a gas or water line. A lot of things that can't be taken for granted if you are the 50+% of the population that is still living in rural areas, and more 70% is classified as rural. Jean's reference to migrants, they're not external migrants. These are migration within China, leaving native place in search of work or opportunity. That the biggest, my judgment, challenge in overcoming this class distinction, very significant distinction between rural is education. That almost nobody living in rural areas goes beyond junior high school. In part because high schools require tuition, and it's tuition as a percentage of household income is the highest in the world. It's not expensive, absolutely, it's expensive relatively. So it makes no sense to send a kid to high school when you can send them to a city to get a job working in a shoe factory and make many times what the family remaining in the countryside. But for China's future development, 50% of the workforce is going to come out of the rural education system, which is inhibited by health problems, by lack of teachers, by lack of teaching equipment, teaching materials, and lack of incentive to stay in schools. That money can help with the problem, but you don't grow a teacher in a week. You can build a school pretty quickly, but creating a thirst for knowledge, a family support system that will encourage people to do their math homework, that takes time. And the timelines for what it will take to address that problem and the already apparent gaps in more highly skilled, not highly skilled, but more highly skilled laborers to keep China competitive in the global production and supply chains. They're just on different timelines. The need is now, the capacity to meet it is years, if not decades away.
Got it, thank you. So a couple of other questions, maybe bounce around a little bit, but related as we maybe transition more to the global side of things. One question, COVID-19 has forced many countries to rethink their dependency on China-based supply chains. Has that impacted China? How will that impact China moving forward, especially as we think about other less critical supply chains, but those which countries may wish to repatriate, for their own nationalistic goals?
Well, let me just start by saying that I think China, in many ways, has been preparing for this. And, in talking to CEOs and talking to both some multinationals, but also local, I think that they're really adopting very diversified strategies. And I don't think that, the impression that I have is that in some ways it's going to be extremely difficult and costly for both the US, but also for other countries to decouple. Does that mean it's going to not having an impact? It is having an impact, and China clearly is very worried about this. But I think that companies are themselves taking strategies, and China is then in a situation where they are going to develop their own suppliers if they cut off the ones from, say, the ones from the US are cut off. So in a sense, this is sort of channeling investment into areas where they clearly are, at least now, still very lacking.
This is an area where I believe corporate decision-making is going to be a lot more important than government decision-making. That Trump administration rhetoric, or some of the members of that administration calling for decoupling, it has very little legal basis. I think will have very little impact. But I have been amazed that multinational corporations, companies operating now in a globalized environment with multi-nation production and supply chains, have allowed the extensive development of change with single points of failure. We have enough examples as when in the floods in Thailand wiped out 90+% of the hard drive manufacturing capability of the world. And it took quite a while to get that back online. Well, more recently, when the Fukushima triple disaster in Japan wiped out a Toyota parts manufacturer that shut down Toyota and other Japanese automaker production around the world for some time. There is a sort of a prudent business rationale for increasing the number of alternatives should you have a problem in one. Part of the difference in the international system is that China had about 15 years of no competition for spots in the emerging global production and supply chains. They were admitted to the free world system, in quotes, without becoming a democracy, without becoming a free world, because it was thought, and accurately, to make them a stronger partner in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Most developing countries wanted no part of being drawn into either the American-led or the Soviet-led system. And they kept their quasi-Stalinist socialist economies. With the end of the Cold War and the obvious positive example of China being able to make a transition into a more market-based, export-led developmental model, now lots of countries want a piece of the action and are capable of moving into the lower ranks of production chains that China has dominated. But labor in China is now a whole lot more expensive than Indonesia or India or Vietnam or Bangladesh, and even Chinese-owned companies are moving out of China to take advantage of opportunities elsewhere. So that larger economic dynamic, I think, is going to be far more important than political rhetoric in Beijing or Washington or anywhere else.
So that leads right into a question which we talked about a little bit, and that is, many now claim that the U.S. policy of engagement with China in the past, was foolish and unsuccessful, because here we are now, contemplating a partial decoupling. Do you agree that the opening with China, that the rapprochement that past administrations had, encouraging China to become part of the liberal world order, was a mistake in hindsight?
I do not. I'm not a completely objective observer in this because I've been involved with it since 1972. I was on the American receiving delegation for ping pong. And I was from the Ford administration in charge of the external team for developing what became known as the strategy of engagement. And then I administered pieces of this in the government. So I'm accepting that I'm not completely objective. The engagement strategy, in my view, and I think empirically it's easier to demonstrate, was phenomenally successful. And it did not have the objective that is now alleged by critics of transforming China into an American-style democracy in any particular time. That I've touched base with all of the people that I was engaged. I was one of the youngest people involved in this process back in the 70s. So I'm one of the smaller number that is still vertical. But those of us who were present at the creation and worked it through all have identical memories, which is not include any kind of goal of political transformation. There was an expectation that modernity would bring about changes. that enlightened self-interest would cause China to behave, but there was no timeline on this. This could take a long time. But let me go at some of the criticisms for being foolish and naive, that it advantaged China and disadvantaged the United States. And sometimes facts actually matter here. That China has increased its GDP very, very substantially. It's now the second largest economy in the world. Per capita GDP is also impressive, went from about $160 to slightly less than $10,000 a year per capita. If that sounds impressive, let me compare it to two things. At $10,000 a year, China is still below the world average. It's below, it ranks in the bottom half of the world. Over that same period, US GDP per capita went from slightly more than $12,000 to $62,000 a year. $50,000 per capita increase. We've got a distribution problem. America became much wealthier. The American people did not become much wealthier. That's our problem, not a Chinese problem. A couple of other things that came about it. There have been no wars in East Asia since the advent of US-China normalization and the advent of engagement. That's the longest period in modern history. And it facilitated the rise of Asia, not just China, but the phenomenal growth of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, much of Southeast Asia. China had been growing, was growing at near 10%. Southeast Asia growing at 6.5%. That's not too bad. And that's 650 million people. China has been drawn into international organizations, the rules-based international order. In 1949, China belonged to 0 international organizations and control regimes. Now it belongs to about 150. And it's learned to use them to defend and advance China's interest. Far better to have them inside, for example, UN peacekeeping operations than outside using the veto to block them in the Middle East. So on whether the dimensions is that the US lost out and China benefit unfairly, no. The closing sentence I would make is that the policy of engagement towards China was not crafted specifically for China. It was an extension of the Cold War strategy developed in the 1950s to strengthen our partners and allies, and then doing that to strengthen and increase the prosperity of the United States by providing disproportionate security to our partners. We didn't expect them to ante up anything like our defense budget, and opening the United States economy, fiscal system, educational system more widely to our partners than they were required to open to us. We accepted the asymmetry. It made us much wealthier. It made them much wealthier and able to buy more stuff from us. It made them much stronger, and made the alliance stronger. And the outcome of the Cold War was we didn't lose on it. China was brought into that, and the same basic policies were applied. We now have a situation where China is no longer a developing country. The Cold War is over. And the American people say correctly, why are we still doing things that were designed for a different time and different conditions? Especially with China, which is so big. And it unfairly takes advantage of the loopholes, of the asymmetries, that if China were Malawi or Uruguay doing the things that it does, it wouldn't matter all that much because they're small. It matters because China is so big.
In that context, give us an update on the Belt and Road Initiative, that long-term strategy that has certainly been started, maybe decades ago, wraps around the world, does involve financing of other countries' infrastructure and perhaps some, debt servitude, by those countries. There's been a little bit of blowback in the last couple of years in isolated spots, but as well, just sort of generally. Is there an implication for that global strategy that China has as a result of some of the pressures it's feeling, both externally and from those internally we've talked about?
All right, well, let me take a stab at that. First, and we've got some, I think, very good chapters in our volume that look at the Belt and Road Initiative. And part of, I think, what needs to be said is that there is sort of the image and the assumptions about BRI and what BRI is actually in reality. And I think that unfortunately, there's been less sort of empirical work done to try to figure out what this is in practice before we can really know what might be its impact. And, again, from my perspective, the way that I'm sort of looking at this project, I am trying to figure out who is actually driving this BRI. And so the assumption is that on one hand, I think many think that this is an extremely well-organized, centrally directed from Beijing. But based on the research I've been able to do so far, those assumptions don't actually hold. A lot of different interests are using BRI to pursue their own interests, which may be quite different from what Beijing intends. I mean, do these projects have security, military implications? Of course they do. All ports and things like that, rail, they obviously do. But that's not the same as saying that this is a well-organized effort from Beijing. And so one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is by looking, sort of trying to do an empirical study of who, what companies and who are actually the actors that are going out and pursuing different projects that are then lumped under this category of BRI. And let me just say that one of the things that links to an earlier topic that we talked about, local government debt. For a while, for actually a long time, the central government has been trying to tamp down local government investments. So they're saying no more, no more of this, infrastructure. However, if they can categorize it as a BRI project, then there's lots of money. And yes, of course you can build that. So we find that a lot of areas, particularly out in sort of the western part, they're doing a lot of projects as part of this quote BRI. But is it really BRI? It's a little unclear. So I think this is a project that we need to look at very empirically and very closely, and just not. We need to, a lot of these assumptions I think may not hold. And so, for example, we have a chapter which looks at the amount of money that China's actually given to its partners that, for these projects. A lot has been pledged, but how much has actually been given? They're actually two very different things.
Interesting. Well, let's pivot towards our friends, the Russians, and the traditional, as you describe in your book, the China-US, USSR, or now Russia strategic triangle, and that relationship, which, as you described, certainly changed after the fall of the Soviet Union and China's perception that as a result, it had less to gain from an alliance with China because now the Soviet Union has fallen away. But it's now been decades since that time. Their economies are certainly on a different footing. What are the dynamics behind the China, U.S., Russian relations today?
The United States is more important to both Moscow and Beijing than either of them is to the other. And that really is a critical factor in this, that limits the prospects for anything approaching alliance or economic partnership. That it really comes down to Russia has oil and natural gas. And there was a time when China wanted that. That with the collapse of global prices for hydrocarbons, less excited about that. There's less there. What's the second reason that brings them together? They both like issues being taken to the United Nations because they've got vetoes in the Security Council. So like the Europeans, they don't like sort of American-led coalitions of the willing. They want to bring it through the UN mechanism because they've got relatively more weight there. And often they do have parallel interest on the issues once they get them into the United Nations arena. But the Russian distrust, fear even of China is real. Chinese disdain for Russia is real. And in some of the numbers, there are fewer Russians between Lake Baikal, which is pretty far west in Siberia, and the Pacific Ocean. There are fewer Russians inhabiting that vast area than live in the city of Beijing. And there is a certain global warming, a little bit of climate change. You can open up and all the Chinese are going to just spill across the border. Maybe a not entirely rational fear, but it's there. But the Chinese, the Russians, the United States, all countries like to leverage relationships to minimize vulnerability. That uncertainty about what China might do was a reason that Nixon went to meet Mao, and it changed the Moscow strategic calculus. That there are still elements of that in the relationship. The more important kind of strategic triangles for China are, can they play off the Europeans and the Japanese against North Americans here around economic and technology transfer and educational issues? And they can up to capitalist competition, but they're also up against common values that constrain them. So I don't lose any sleep about the prospects of a restoration of a Russia-Chinese alliance. I think it's more important that, this is one where I actually agree with the Trump administration, that bringing the Chinese into strategic weapons negotiations, because the Americans and the Russians are stuck, because both of them have to plan for contingencies involving Chinese arms buildup. And that prevents reductions that both of the Russians and the Americans would like to make.
Well, fascinating to think of millions of Chinese crossing the border into Eastern Russia. Does the same type of calculus apply with respect to North Korea? Certainly China has a worrisome knot to manage there, with the border of Koreas. Can you discuss that briefly? And as we have maybe just a minute or two left, also comment on perhaps the challenge in the Arctic and what China is likely to do there.
Yes, I'll take these foreign policy questions. With China has maybe 90% of North Korea's trade. I think that would give it great leverage. It's right next door, another authoritarian. In fact, in my assessment, China doesn't have much leverage. The leverage actually is with North Korea. It has the capacity to make trouble, to destabilize the region. It doesn't even have to do anything. It could declare a closure to ships And that would drive up insurance rates, which would make foreign trade and investment more expensive coming out of North China's Rust Belt. It could fire up the possibility of conflict in the neighborhood. War in Korea for us is an away game. For China, it's right next door in there. So it is a knotty problem, and generational changes have made a difference. That the generation that fought and died in Korea, of Chinese who fought and died in Korea, or their parents or grandparents, they're gone. And that younger generation says, why are we embracing this god-awful regime that threatens us? The Arctic, I don't know, the Chinese want to be a part of everything and think they're entitled to be a part of everything. And since we have an inclusive approach, it says, sure, come to the meeting, be a part of the discussions about the Arctic. I don't envision them being a major player. But this, one of the asymmetries is that China is an observer at the Organization of American States, and they block us from being an observer at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China and Russia and the Central Asians.
With that, as we are just about, if not a minute past our time, on behalf of myself, certainly the organization and all our audience, thank you both professors for your time and your insights today. We really appreciate your being here, and I want to turn it over to Nora for conclusion. Thank you. You need to unmute, Nora.
Having a technical challenge, my apologies. Sorry, we had technical challenges here. I wish to thank Professor Fingar and Professor Oi for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. We're immensely grateful. I often say that I think before they sign any politician to a political position for making decisions in the Senate and Congress, they really need to put them through a mentorship program through our academic world so they can learn and understand, and especially learn from the history. So thank you so much. We're also thanking all of our guests. We had guests from all over the US joining us today, and also our loyal members. Immensely grateful for that. Please check our website for the upcoming programs toward the end of the month. It seems like we've literally been having weekly webinars now by partnering with our other councils. With that, I wish all of you a safe afternoon and a good evening, and thank you so very much again. Hope we can join you soon, and I will definitely get the book and learn more about the challenges and opportunities of our neighboring countries. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.